Hi Ved, how have you been?
Good, good, bro. The lockdown is getting like too extended for my liking.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure you know, but I'm keeping myself busy. Like finally started watching Netflix shows.
Have you seen Money Heist?
Going Money Heist. Yeah, Money Heist long before the lockdown, but it's up to season two.
Okay.
These new shows have come up. Like not that I'm watching them, I just got 5 minutes of Mahabharata.
Oh,
But
okay.
Mahabharata and Sri Krishna and Ramayana, they're airing them again.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people in India are taken up with these shows. Cinematography is too slow. The way their scenes move and the pace at which they take the narrative forward. And but worst I think is so many people are talking about on social media these days, but so many of them are misinterpreting it left, right, and center. And
Mm-hmm.
now that it's been aired in new contexts and new times with 21st century problems around the viewers, it's been taken in a very botched up way. Like very far
Yeah.
from what the original intention of the text is.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, honestly speaking, I think people have always botched up the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and I don't think people have actually understood what it stands for. And I think the reason for that comes down to the fact that we have been applying Western standards to understand Indian myths. So just to give a simple
True.
example, let's take if you go and ask a class 6 boy what is the Ramayana about, he'll probably tell you that the Ramayana is about good versus evil, good embodied in Ram, evil embodied in Ravan. Ram beats Ravan, so good prevails over evil. And even like the usual annual Dashera celebrations are testament to that. But that's because we have been applying the Western concepts and Western narratives to the Ramayana to understand it, that we get this concept of good and evil. Fundamentally, the Ramayana isn't about good and evil, it's about something else. And I was reading about the three main narrative structures that myths essentially contain. So you have one structure which is the classical structure or the Greek structure. Then the second is the biblical structure, which comes from the Bible and forms the basis of Christianity. The third is the Hindu structure. Now, Hindu in the sense that any concept or any structure that is original to India geographically. This is not so much about Hinduism and the religious definitions, but concepts that originated in India. What really struck me was the differences between these concepts. So you have the Greek concept, which primarily is about the cultivation of heroes. So it's good versus evil, but it's also about the idea of heroes aspiring to a certain level of greatness. So a classic example of that would be Achilles, in the Homeric epics, and what Achilles
Yeah.
does to turn the fate of the Battle of Troy and then rise to heaven. And the Greeks even have a special heaven for these heroes called Elysium. The biblical narrative is more about finding a leader who can mobilize the people and take them towards a collective goal. And this leader is not an egomaniac, he's not a narcissist, or he's not a deluded leader like fascist leaders have been in the past in the real world. But this leader is genuinely enlightened and he has knowledge of what constitutes insight or wisdom. So, again, a classic example would be a Moses or, well, a Jesus Christ more pertinently. But the Hindu narrative, interestingly enough, is not about leaders, it's not about journey or transformation, it's not about good and evil. It's basically about being, about existing and finding your own way to salvation. And salvation from, again, salvation not in the Christian context, but as a release from the cycle of birth and rebirth. And it's premised on karma. So, what you have between Ravan and Ram in the Ramayana is not so much a struggle of good and evil, but a struggle of two different approaches to life. Ravan, with his more narcissistic knowledge of all the scriptures and his ego, whereas Ram being somebody who, in spite of being a divine avatar, does not understand his own potential and constantly lives in doubt as he goes on to fulfill what he sees his duty. So it's two
Okay.
different approaches to life.
Okay, the Greek narrative I largely agree with, but I think the Hindu narrative I will disagree with to large extent. See, the Greek narrative is far more nuanced than this, right? I can make it into three large divisions, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Like telltale features of what would comprise the Greek philosophy is that first is Stoicism, right? Reason is the soul of everything they do.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you read their philosophers and if you read their early thoughts, how they've made rationale the basis of interpreting everything around them is a large part of how they then churned out their future literature.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is, I think they focused a lot on how their divinity was very localized. Okay, so even though there is a pantheon of the gods, And their divinity gets very localized in specific areas like Athens or Apollo, when specific people worship specific virtues based on what the seasons and what the local economy around them is. So it gets boiled down, like it gets so fragmented that you can't identify this particular virtue coming out of the Greek narrative. And it's very difficult to pinpoint and say that the binary idea is a specific thing which you find in Greek myths.
Okay.
For example, there came a time when I think the Greek and Hindu narratives started doing some like very similar things, like Hesiod, for example, where he starts in like, as opposed to what Homer used to do. He didn't talk about gods, right? He started talking about heroes and virtues and even dead people and making great legacy for them. He started talking about how these virtues are things people should imbibe in themselves, and his stories were to that effect. The third thing, where they come very close to the karma idea, is the idea of the stain of sin remaining on future generations. Right? So, for example, when Prometheus is writing about his tragedies, they talk even in say Zeus and how he takes even the Pandora's box and how he sends a gift to Pandora, and the many myths, even Hercules, and how because his cousin, because he wasn't liked by the person who he was a slave to, and he had nothing to do with the enmity. It was created by another person altogether who sent him to work as a slave. The 12 tasks of Hercules, which is so romanticized, it takes origin in the idea that you have a stain of a sin which is not yours, not yours in the making, right? That is where you get closest to the later part of the Hindu philosophy. But I still think that we need to look at Hindu philosophy in a far more diverse manner, right? Yeah. So when you say Hindu, do you mean the later Hindu texts like Mahabharata, Ramayana, and the things which we associate as connotations of Hinduism today? Or you go back to Sanatana Dharma, right, which is, say, what I identify with. Like, I would identify as Hindu. Because the Persians, they said whoever lives in India is a Hindu. So the word Hindu comes from her Hindu. Anyone on the other side of the Indus, where the Indus is called Hindu. And right? So it has nothing to do with the religion. What did kind of break the Gordian knot of philosophy was Rig Veda. Right? And the Rig Veda does not mention karma. It mentions an order or a rite, which is a specific set of things which you must do. They give you values, they give you ways of leading your life. And if you violate that, you commit a sin. Right? And they call it as aghas. And it proscribes kindness, truth, people like things binding on people. It tells you adultery and witchcraft is wrong. Where we find karma, and this is very interesting, is that around, say, 1000 BC, some 900 BC, when they started going south, these guys started meeting tribes who believed in superstitions and worshipping trees and spirits and all kinds of voodoo, Indian voodoo. And to explain concepts to them, they were in a way dumbed down. They were in a way evolved, and instead of wiping these tribes out, the Aryans evolved the Rig Veda to an extent where the new Atharva Veda and the Yajur Veda and the later Vedas came out, and that incorporated the idea of if you break the rites, because they needed to be far more firm with the new populace coming into their social spectrum.
Yeah.
They came up with the idea of there is a reward/punishment, and how, man is an architect of his own face, but if you don't do this, you won't go to the milk and honey land of heaven, which the Rig Veda talks about, right? Which is where karma comes in. And even then, karma doesn't get crystallized till the Vedanta philosophy comes and talks about karma yoga and jnana yoga and raj yoga and bhakti yoga. It tells you why there is a good and a bad, not an evil. It doesn't identify evil, but it tells you that there are specific things you must do, based on which you will either become an ascetic and you merge with God, or you become a householder and reach some kind of a purgatory, or you become wicked as a whole and get reborn as a lower form, like an ant or a dog or something, right? And it does tell you that, look, there is no particular right way. So that's where you're completely correct. Exactly. It does say there is no particular way of going about life, that there are, of course, some things which are inviolable. Like you can't cheat on your partner, for example. But it tells you that if you're within the reach, then there are multiple ways to approach life, and choice is an illusion, because anything you do with concentration is leading you to God, and the talk of knowledge is the final name. So the entire genesis is important.
And I think what is interesting and what makes the Hindu thought more appealing to me in this regard, and again, just to clarify, I mean Hindu from a geographical sense of the term, not in the religious sense of the term. So what appeals to me is the fact that truth is seen as a concept of multiplicity. So there is not one single narrative. So for example, in the Christian texts, you do get the overwhelming narrative of Christ, and what Christ prescribes. So while Hinduism gives you advice, gives you suggestions, it doesn't, in terms of its myths, actually concretize one single narrative and prescribe that one single narrative. So the truth is more evenly distributed. Even if you look at the characters of
Okay.
Hinduism in the myths, so for example, you take a Mahabharata, there are lessons to be learned from all the characters, from Yudhishthir to Arjun to even Duryodhan to Krishna. No one single character can be hailed as the ideal role model because they quite simply are not. They are more realistic in the sense they have their own flaws, and there is a lesson to be derived from each one of them. Whereas I think with the Greek legends and even with Christianity, there is greater concentration of virtues in a single individual, so that they become larger than life. So I think that's another thing that appeals to me
Ah,
about the Hindu characterization. And the other thing before we move on, I think the idea of truth not being singular is also very important, because the moment you say that okay, truth is concentrated in one figure, and that is a sort of symptom of myths that are revolved around the idea of the prophet. So for Christianity or like Islam, the idea that there is one single individual that knows all the truths in the world because he is an embodiment of God is really problematic, I believe, because it is what leads to the birthing of hierarchies. Because once you have knowledge concentrated in one individual, you suddenly have power that comes to the knowledge concentrated in that one individual. And that creates hierarchies which are problematic. Whereas I think what the Hindu philosophy tries to enunciate is that there are things you can learn from the pauper, as well as the prince, as well as the philosopher, and nobody in their individual capacities has access to universal wisdom.
correct. I don't think it's as clear as that. I
Mm-hmm.
do agree with large parts of it. For example, the Hindu structure clearly tells you not to create a hierarchy, except in terms of who's more knowledgeable and less knowledgeable.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even though there it makes some exceptions.
Hmm.
But I don't think there is a unity of narrative more prominent in the Christian beliefs than in the Hindu beliefs. Tell you
Okay.
why? Because even in the Hindu beliefs, they talk about one bottom line. Like even though the bottom line is difficult to identify many times because the metaphysical nature of the text. For example, Tattvam Ati, or thou art that,
Mm-hmm.
as in I am the spirit, and like everyone's one cosmic brain called the Mahat. That is very apparent throughout the Sanatana Dharma text and even today,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the Christian philosophy, where even in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, he talks about the kingdom of God belongs to X, and happy are those who do specific things, and the kingdom of God belongs to them. And in the many apostles, and if you notice, so the discourse around whether the resurrection is true or not, whether it happened or not, and the Catholic, Protestant, and Greek Orthodox divisions,
Mm-hmm.
it's because there's a lot of dispute also regarding what Christianity believes in certain set of ideals, right? That's fair.
Mm-hmm.
But what constitutes a higher ideal and lower ideal, and whether God meant something to be as deep as level X and level X plus one
Mm-hmm.
is still very much debated within the followers of the religion. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that we can't pinpoint and say that Christianity gives a unified narrative. Because
Yeah, yeah.
even if you go right down to the Bible, they've given a lot. They've given they've given a code of conduct
Hmm.
and not a bottom line.
Yes.
Whereas they do give you a bottom line in Hinduism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but also
Right?
what I mean when I say that Hinduism gives you this multiplicity of truth is that even if there is a bottom line, and even if there is, let's say, less or more uniformity than what the Christian narratives provide, and I think this is also important to note that the Bible was compiled by numerous individuals over numerous years, so there is bound to be a sort of incoherence in the narrative. But what I'm trying to say is that even within individual narratives, there is greater ambivalence in the Hindu texts than there are in the Christian ones and the Greek ones. And that ambivalence is what I think is very important, because it allows individual interpretations of what constitutes the idea of morality. I mean, Hinduism, or rather the Hindu myths, are, at least to my mind, primarily amoral, because they don't contain the idea of right or wrong as we come to understand from Christianity or as we come to understand from the Greek myths. It's more about focusing on what you said about karma, and also the chain of events and causality, that if you do something, one thing leads to another. So for me, God therein in the Hindu myths becomes more of an accountant than a judge, and trying to figure out the causality. So do you think that this concept that Hinduism purports to produce, that there is no right or wrong, except there are certain things which lead to more things and which lead to other things, and you need to be aware of this chain of events. So do you think this is a
Hmm.
healthier philosophy in today's world where, narratives are so difficult to understand because of post-truth
Hmm.
and polarization? Or do you think that
Hmm.
fundamentally it's still more important to create those binaries of right or wrong because our conception of justice revolves around understanding what is right and wrong?
Oh no, so I do think the Hindu philosophy and the idea of not having a binary is far more important and far more relevant. But I want to like make a slight modification to what the philosophy is. Right?
Mm-hmm.
For example, it is amoral to a large extent in when it talks about the consequence and cause effect, because it tells you things like, look, every action you take is just a wave forming in your head, and it gets subtler and subtler with time.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back into memory, and it's going to somewhere influence whatever you do in the future because it never fully goes out of existence. So
Mm-hmm.
everything you've done in a very scientific way still continues to impact you. So it was
Right.
a very amoral subscription, like prescription.
Hmm.
But it was moral to the extent that right from like 1200 BC in the Rig Veda, it talks about something called the Purusharth, which is meaning of Purush, like meaning of men, and to
Hmm.
be very like literal in translation, which gives you a very micromanaging code of conduct.
Mm-hmm.
And there, if you don't, if there, it's prescribed as a moral, and there's
Hmm.
no two ways to it. So if you follow it, you're moral. If you don't follow it, you are immoral. And
Yes.
even so, that with that as the bedrock of morality, it then leaves you free to far more agency as compared to what we think
Hmm.
today. Like it's not as prescriptive as we say it is today, but it
Hmm.
is prescriptive to some extent.
So.
But coming to the idea of what is
Hmm.
more palatable for like a 21st century person, I do think the appreciation of nuance is a big problem we have today.
Yes,
And that is
absolutely. Hmm.
something we need to do. Very simple example is like take Mahabharata again, right?
Hmm.
If you're talking about, so we all know like Arjun was a great archer, and all, right? And if this was a Salman Khan film or if this was a Bollywood film, there would be a binary, and the
Hmm.
Pandavas will kill the Kauravas, and like so be it.
Yeah, and they'll be
What
celebrated
they
and
show here?
venerated, the Pandavas, for doing
Oh
that.
yes,
Yes.
yeah,
Hmm.
and Salman Khan and Arjun is the hero.
Yes.
Right? What they
Hmm.
do here is that even when Bhishma Pitam is on a bed of arrows
Hmm.
and he's thirsty, right? So there are two things to note there. First is that Krishna tells him that you must pay obeisance to your elders, right? Regardless of whether
Hmm.
you're on the other side of the war, because there is no war after that person is on his deathbed.
Hmm.
And he gives him a drink of water. The second more noticeable thing is the bottom line that your skill is not to be a destructive skill, even if you're on a battlefield.
Hmm.
It's supposed to still work as a constructive skill. And that nuance is one of the things you will ignore in modern times because we are so used to a masala and a binary of good and bad.
Hmm.
He uses his arrow to break the earth at a point where he knows there is water
Yes.
and create a spring so that the man who's lying on a bed can
Hmm.
open his mouth and water can go in. Right? So these nuances, I think, comprise the spirit of the Mahabharata more than the war of the Kauravas and the Pandavas. And there are
Absolutely.
billions of such nuances in it.
Absolutely. And also, it's important to understand in the context of the Mahabharata that there were no real winners per se. Like, okay, the
Mm-hmm.
Pandavas beat Kauravas and they assumed control of the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
But they also
Mm-hmm.
lost their sons. Like, all the Pandavas lost their sons. And
Mm-hmm.
that is as big a loss as you can have in your lifetime as a parent. So,
Definitely.
yeah, and I think what you mentioned about, a typical Salman Khan film or a Bollywood film, I
Mm-hmm.
think if you just look at the idea of fiction, whether it be in books or whether it be in cinema, the fact that there needs to be a narrative where there needs to be a protagonist and there needs to be an antagonist, and the story needs to be told through these binaries in less or more terms, less or more nuance, is a fundamentally Greek narrative. But it's amazing how we have assumed that this is the natural order of things. But in life, that's not the case, right? Because I mean, of course, if any one of us is telling their life stories as part of an autobiography, we will create heroes and villains in our own stories. But an objective person
Mm-hmm.
would be able to tell you that in most cases in life, there are no heroes or villains. We are all a mixture of contradictions. I think that's what
Mm-hmm.
the Hindu myths try and address to a certain extent,
Mm-hmm.
better than perhaps
Yes.
the Greek or the biblical narratives do.
Yes, I think the Hindu myths talk a lot like Harry Potter. They
Hmm.
tell you there's light and dark in both of like there's both light and dark in all of us.
Yes, and the ultimate
So
embodiment of that in Harry Potter would be Severus Snape.
exactly. That's how he
Hmm.
only says it. But I think we can put it down to two reasons. The first
Hmm.
is that the Hindu myths, like the Sanatan Dharma text, have evolved. Like I talked about, like the superstitions and the Atharva Veda, the new tribes that came in.
Mm-hmm.
It evolved to suit the superstitions of people over the ages, right? And especially with Buddhism and Jainism, and a fundamental deviation that happened in terms of karma and jnana, and whether we support just the rites robotically or whether we support the idea of knowledge will set you free.
Mm-hmm.
Like that evolution, like somewhere led to a lot of corruptions, right? And like that happens because of the second reason, which is that everything in or in the Sanatana Dharma philosophy comes very tightly packed with the metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
So just compare the biblical and the Hindu philosophies, right? Without going into detail. It talks about the Sermon on the Mount, for example, or the Acts and like say the epistles. They give you very simple ideas of how God performed His miracles and how people prayed and how things came about as a result and what realizations came about. And it's made in a way that appeals to the peasants, because it was someone who was born God but born as a commoner, among commoners, preaching to the peasants. On the other hand, the Vedic seers were the more erudite part of their society. And the texts talk in a way of a poet come academic talking down to the people. Yes. And it requires a lot of translation and a lot of dumbing down before it can be made palatable and interpreted in more humanized scenarios. And that's not always possible, especially in times of, you'll see war or in times of tumult in society. We lost a lot of the basis of where the Vedas and where the Upanishads came from, which is why Christianity, for example, is simpler.
Yes, it's more accessible. It's
right?
Something that you can explain more easily to a commoner.
Exactly, and it talks of miracles, So what the problem, I think, is that the Sanatana Dharma texts try a lot to also be a science. Of course, in a lot of ways they do a great job, but Christianity never tries to do that. I still think the Sanatana Dharma texts are far more profound, because they end up giving you a lot of things which,
And I think that's
because Christianity is just more appealing.
That's because the Hindu myths are primarily philosophical texts that have been adapted into religious practices, whereas the other myths are structured more along the lines of proper dogma or proper religion. They are not as much a philosophical explanation of the world as the Hindu texts are. But moving on to a different angle, let's say you had to bring up a kid, and at some point in our lives we'd have to do that. You have to bring up a kid. So which worldview would you introduce them to? Would you go with the Greek narrative of good versus evil?
The Hindu narrative.
The Hindu narrative. Okay. But why? Primarily why?
Yeah. So let's just take an example, right? So this is greatly interesting. Let's compare a Greek and a Hindu parable, a biblical and a Hindu parable. Say the theme is utilitarianism, right? I'm trying to teach him why it's okay to choose the path of larger good. The Bible, in the Acts of the Apostles, tells you how Peter and John performed a miracle, and the people of Israel saw that, and Peter and John were subtly deified, and they told them that you must do good. But they didn't understand. So the people of Israel went and prayed, and the gods, like the earth shook, and God gave them realization for their prayer, and they suddenly realized that some kind of like a socialist message of some kind. They sold all their property, all their livestock, and with the money they bought bread and gave it to the poor, and everyone lived in a far more cooperative and egalitarian way, right? So that's one. Second, so the conflict there was a very essential, should I care for myself and do the best I can do and just for my family, or a more socialist construct? That's the conflict. On this side, the Hindu philosophy gives you, in the Vedanta philosophy, there's a poor boy who's been told that the Bhagavad Gita imbibes all the truths of the universe, and you must read it if you want to gain enlightenment and help the world. So he starts reading it, but he's poor and he doesn't have light, so he starts reading it by the light of a candle.
Yeah.
And along comes a man and he tells him, look, because you're reading by the candlelight, there are a lot of insects which are burning to death because of the candle. And so, but he says, but the larger good is that I'm reading the Bhagavad Gita and I can go back and become a far more value-adding member of society if I do that. So who cares about the insects?
Yes.
But he said, even the Bhagavad Gita will tell you ahimsa parama dharma. You can't be violent even to the smallest of creatures. So there's essentially a conflict. Yes. And that's where Vedanta comes in and tells you that in this situation, the larger good makes, because there is always good and bad. There is right and wrong. And you must take an accepted cost where in the face of a larger benefit, when the larger benefit is very evident. And then it talks about how to identify larger benefit. Right?
Yes. And I think this is very
But
important.
look at the level of reasoning. Exactly. Like if I'm explaining to the child, this arises out of reason. The apostles of the act, not to say all of Christianity is like that, but the apostles arises like primarily from a diktat. And a diktat
Yes.
is so much more difficult to explain than
Mm.
reason.
And the thing is, once you start questioning that diktat, you don't arrive at a
Mm.
premise from which you can assume
Mm.
wisdom. You just end up in a position
Mm.
where either you become a non-believer or you feel that you have to be dogmatic and you don't question these things because they are the words of God, as it were. But I think the other thing that you also spoke about is that in terms of decision making, it's important to
Mm.
understand that each decision comes with its own costs. So, for example, today, if
Mm.
I'm wearing a pair of Nike sneakers, I also
Mm.
have taken into account that somewhere in some town of Africa, maybe child laborers were used to manufacture these Nike sneakers, at least if these sneakers were manufactured in the early parts of the 21st century. So the fact that what I am enjoying as a luxurious item and what I am sort of regaling in as a comfort product can be the consequence of somebody's immense discomfort is something that can create cognitive dissonance, because I may be a huge fan of Nike, I may be a huge fan of a Roger Federer who used to endorse a Nike, and yet at the same time I have to realign my faith in Nike with the concept that this company used to exploit child laborers. There are consequences attached to each and everything, and no action in and of itself is noble, or no action in and of itself
Mm.
is completely disgusting, is very important for the understanding of decision making, I believe. And even if you take
Mm.
into account, let's say, sustenance, right? I mean, the food that comes on
Mm.
our plate is the food, irrespective of whether you're a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian, is the
Yep.
product of certain compromises made by certain actors in the chain. So if you, like, for example, are grazing the cattle, or if you're tilling the fields, then there
Mm.
are microorganisms that are perishing. So in order to create survival and in order to have sustenance, there needs to be compromise, and there needs to be, to put it plainly, killing. So society is about sort of trying to adjust and create a balance between those conflicting elements and between those compromises. I think that's what the Hindu
Mm.
texts arrive at more profoundly than the others.
Definitely, definitely. The Hindu texts
Yeah.
talk a lot about cooperation. It stems from the idea that they say, like every being is one. It's very
Mm-hmm.
close to like so. They also try to justify it through string theory, like
Mm-hmm.
the very religious version of a string theory, and how everything is just basically one connected form of matter. But they do tell you that the final aim is paropkar, that
Mm-hmm.
you keep doing good to others, and like that forms the bedrock of everything, and it will also be like the one way to atone for all like misdeeds you've done. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, what you mentioned was on how like it calls for like the idea of a one person or a one prophet calls for some kind of a dilution of the message, right? What
Mm-hmm.
you're getting at, and I think that's very true. What happens is that with one role model, for example, the Christ,
Mm-hmm.
and as opposed to no God man in Hinduism, you have many diverse models. You have a very clearly interpretable idea of what that person is saying, what the prophet is saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have very diverse morals because it does not go into nuance, and you really like that about Hindu philosophy because
Mm-hmm.
each character is representing something, and it's
Mm-hmm.
so. For example, if you're giving me a Shakuni,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're giving me any villain like Kans, who also have a lot of great traits. Like even Ravan, for example, is a Brahmin and a very very
He's a
known
scholar.
person.
He's
And
effectively a
there is and
scholar, Ravan.
he's a scholar.
Yeah.
He's a scholar,
Mm-hmm.
and Durvasa Rishi is one of the most accomplished rishis, the most
Mm-hmm.
accomplished sages. But he goes and kicks God on the chest,
Mm-hmm.
and God punishes him
Mm-hmm.
because that they tell you that good comes mixed with its own aberrations,
Yes.
and the aberration can't be accepted.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, they show very realistic flaws in their character, except
Yeah.
of course when God is reincarnated.
Yeah.
And they tell you that even though we are edifying and romantic, like celebrating the good in this, we're telling you look at the larger picture and think.
Mm-hmm.
There will be like bad things about each person, right? And for example, Yudhishthira is not at all a practical character,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Absolutely.
they tell you look at the larger picture.
Yes, and I think what this also creates, the moment you start seeing the shades of grey, is that you also start having sympathy for people who are not of the same stance as yourself. So maybe in the Mahabharata, your allegiance may be towards the Pandavas because you think they represent Dharma. But you also can sympathize with certain aspects of Duryodhan. You can also sympathize with certain aspects of Shakuni and Karna, who are on the other side of the spectrum. And this is very important in today's day and age, because in the age of hyper social media activity, we are becoming a polarized planet. So it's becoming more difficult for people to communicate across ends of the spectrum. So simple example, right? Today, for example, I mean, I identify myself as left of center in the political spectrum. If I go ahead and speak to somebody who's a right winger, and we start debating a certain issue, very quickly our ideas become filtered by our identities. Because we can no longer sympathize with each other as individuals. We are merely debating and creating a discourse on the basis of our identities. And that is problematic because the moment you detach sympathy from conversation, you are prone to making a discussion about ideology and more prone to sort of going down the spectrum where what Hinduism describes as vivad rather than samvad. Vivad being that your identity precedes the idea, and samvad being the other way around. So I think in a polarized discourse, Hindu myths have a lot to teach us about how to inculcate sympathy in each other so that we just start listening, just start listening better instead of all these
Oh,
trolling and
yes.
labeling people as bhugs or secular and all that stuff.
So even right from the Samved, it talks about how there is no, in the Samartha Brahman, it talks about how there is no wrong, there is only error. And
Yes.
throughout all Sanatana Dharma philosophy is telling you that death, life, good, bad is all a difference of degree and not of kind,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that you don't hate the sinner. And I think that's very important, especially in terms of course, there are evils, right? In 21st century, you must apply it very selectively. And you know
Yeah.
there are specific evils.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of condemnation is far simpler if you're thinking of something as a wrong and not as an error on part of something of someone who would otherwise be part of the deeds, which is the same as yours.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, I think it bars any further discussion on the subject. If you're on news media and are shouting castrate the rapist, right? It's not a wrong, it's perhaps not a wrong clamor, right? That's debatable. But to make that the be all and end all is very wrong, because if condemnation becomes the sole hyperbole,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of going beyond that to investigate the why things happen, what the systemic problem is, doesn't happen. And that's why we need to push people towards that kind of a discussion, and it doesn't happen
Exactly.
organically.
And I think,
Hinduism solves
yeah.
that problem.
Hmm. And a very good example is what you said about the rapist, right? Especially in light of the Nirbhaya case and the hanging of the rapist that happened, I think, sometime in February. So, I mean, capital punishment is something that a lot of people just take as a moral absolute because they feel beyond a point in time certain crimes deserve the punishment of death. But that is where we have
Yeah,
to question, right? I mean, fair enough, it's a heinous crime. There is no debating that. But what is the practical purpose of hanging somebody to death? Because that is effectively the foundation of a system of retribution on part of the justice system and not a system of reformation. And are we going ahead and saying that no criminal is in a position, or rather, there are certain crimes where a criminal cannot be reformed? And are we saying that? And in that case, does that person become dispensable? Are questions that we need to sort
exactly.
of tussle with as a society. And that is where Hinduism, with its idea of not condemning people, creates a more discursive environment where you're addressing these issues because you feel that every issue requires questioning. So I think this is a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you know how it differs from what we know in 21st century is essentially that today we think there is a binary which is not unbreakable, right? In the sense that if there's someone who's incorrect, if you're agreeing to capital punishment, you're saying he'll always be on that path, and the order which you subscribe to cannot ever absorb that person who you've identified as an enemy of the order.
Hmm.
What the Vedic texts, on the other hand, tell you is that, look, knowledge will set you free to the level where you increase in consciousness, you realize what the truth is, whatever it may be. It doesn't tell you there is a single answer to meaning of life.
Hmm.
And it then tells you you'll be one with the elements, right? So it tells you how higher purpose of any sort, whatever the purpose, even if it's sweeping the floors, right? If you identify that as a purpose, you do it in the best possible manner, and it leads you to a knowledge which sets you free and makes you as conscious, leads you to a supra conscious level. Right?
Hmm. Hmm.
What, how that is opposed to our current times is that we think we cannot reform, and this tells you that, look, reformation will not happen. The most beautiful part there is that Vedanta philosophy, like Swami Vivekananda preached that so much, right? He went and said that, sorry, this is the Sri Ramakrishna quote, Yatha mat tat pat, right? There are as many philosophies as there are philosophers, but the truth is one.
Yes.
There are as many paths as philosophers.
Hmm.
And that's crazy, because that's one thing which is so lost in the kind of crime and justice systems we see today.
Hmm.
We don't think that we don't think there is a possibility of a philosophy that opposes ours, which is why these problems. If we just feel that knowledge in itself isn't one, but knowledge by itself is something to be romanticized, it just solves so many things.
Exactly. And the idea that argumentation is about reaching a position where you can come up with silver bullets, and when you can
Mm.
come up with
Mm.
propositions that cannot be defeated is fallacious in and of itself, because the purpose of argument
Mm.
is that there is always a rebuttal no matter wherever you are. And I think that
Exactly.
level of discourse is
Mm.
something, and to be honest, it was there in the Hellenic tradition,
Mm.
outside the myths. So with like the Socratic
Mm.
dialogue is based on that concept of dialectics, but I think it
Mm.
wasn't embodied as much in the Greek myths, and certainly not in the Christian myths. And perhaps to a
Mm.
certain extent, even if it was in the Hindu myths, it hasn't become as accessible because, as you said earlier, the language is something that is not democratic.
Mm.
So I
Mm.
think as we sort of wrap this discussion up, it's important to remember that
Mm.
we take so many things for granted, right? I mean, of
Yeah.
course, with the coronavirus that's ravaging the world,
Mm.
we come to realize
Mm.
a lot of these things that we take for granted, our liberties, our
Mm.
friends, our relationships, but also the narratives,
Yeah.
the stories that we have been told. The motive of revenge, for
Mm.
example, that, if somebody does harm to
Mm.
you, it's okay if you get back
Mm.
at them. And the
Mm.
other day I was listening to this interview by Subramaniam Swami, where he's talking about how
Yep.
his politics is dictated by revenge.
Okay.
So he said that he
Okay.
was snubbed by the liberal intellectuals when he came as a conservative intellectual into
Mm.
India in the
Mm.
70s, and he
Mm.
named Amartya Sen and singled him out as somebody who did not like
Mm.
Subramaniam Swami's right wing proclivities. And now that
Okay.
his ideology is in power, he openly said that I'm going to take back control
Mm.
and I'm going to take my revenge on these people that snubbed me earlier. And that's such a hollow
Mm.
ideology coming not only from a great public figure of eminence, but
Mm.
also
Mm.
from any individual. But we as a
Mm.
society have tended to take this narrative of revenge for granted because we see that all the time reiterated in popular culture. The idea of the hero
Mm.
avenging the villain,
Mm.
the avenging somebody that he has
Yep.
lost and taking
Mm.
revenge on the villain is so common, right? And I think that's where we need
Mm.
to start questioning
Exactly.
these narratives. Where do they come from, and how can we actually evolve them?
Oh, so a lot of things there, right? So let's put it in both the Greek and a Hindu way, right?
Hmm.
In the Greek sense, like the goddess Nemesis, where the word Nemesis comes from.
Yeah.
Very ironically, at least the most, I don't know if it's the or just the most romanticized story of hers, but she takes part in avenging insults for a nymph who is not even related to her.
Mm-hmm.
She enters the situation and suddenly she takes vengeance on part of Echo, who's a forest nymph, and when
Mm-hmm.
she's not even part of the situation, and she introduces the concept of revenge to two perfectly beautiful people. And
Mm-hmm.
Greek mythology is telling you that interpersonal equations can function in the absence of the concept of revenge, and that this is
Absolutely.
always an interference. That is the role of Nemesis in the story, without going into the story itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I think a lot of our philosophers differ with like primarily because he reminded me of him, Amartya Sen, right? Because
Hmm.
when he talks about argumentative Indian and
Yes.
the philosophy, the way we debate,
Mm-hmm.
that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
The way we debated was not vivad, which is what we do today.
Yeah.
What we did was shastra, which was like analysis and engagement, so as to reach a very conclusive meaning of what
Mm-hmm.
the shastras or what the text told us.
Mm-hmm.
But what you ask about the characters, right? I think it's very important. Is even if you're studying like Shakespeare or Wordsworth, so also if you're studying Vedic texts of Mahabharata and Ramayana, right?
Hmm.
When you're analyzing their characters, you go back to the context in which they were formed. Like you
Exactly.
can't know the poem unless you know the poet, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
still think that if you're going back to the socio-economic lives of the Vedic ages and how it evolved, how they went down south, met different tribes, how it was corrupted and evolved and being thought of as evolved, but in a sense corrupted later on,
Mm-hmm.
and why Buddha essentially preaches a lot of Hinduism with just some fundamental changes,
Mm-hmm.
same with Jainism. I think that socio-economic genesis has to go hand in hand if you're trying to understand what the characters mean. Because if you
Yes.
appreciate just the binary, and if you just take away
Mm-hmm.
the binary,
Mm-hmm.
then I even know people who can identify the Mahabharata, like talk of things in the Mahabharata, and because they're thoughtful enough and morally like bankrupt enough, they can justify all their vices through characters in the Mahabharata, right? They can justify gambling and drinking and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But if you appreciate the nuance, you
Mm-hmm.
understand what it truly means.
Absolutely. And I think, therefore, in the final part of this discussion, we can safely
Yep.
say
Yep.
that the biggest takeaway from talking about myths is that the
Mm-hmm.
one lesson that all these myths teach us, whether it's the Greek, whether it's the Bible, whether it's Hindu myths, is that you've got to question. You've got to question structures that are imposed on your behavior, that are imposed on your political identity, that are imposed on your daily functioning of life, Because the moment you stop questioning, you start taking things for granted. And that's where everything from the appreciation of a nuance to the detection of contexts to the understanding of motivations behind characters and attribution of those motivations start becoming problematic. So I think
Exactly.
it's time
And
to change the
question with,
discourse around myths
yep.
and look at them as sort of enhancing inquisitiveness rather than providing answers, asking the right questions instead of
Exactly.
giving us the right answers.
Exactly. Look at them in their original, in their authentic meanings, right? And like start questioning so that you reach the authentic meaning, because it's not easy to. And like be willing to make your own conclusions.
Absolutely. Great. So I think on that note, we'll keep it at that. And next week, hopefully, we'll be asking more questions, even if we aren't able to arrive at the answers.
Definitely.
Okay. Chalo. Bye.
Chalo. Bye.
Hi, guys. Thank you for listening to this episode of That's What We Said. If there are stories from mythology that have shaped your worldview or transformed your thinking, do let us know in the comment section. Press the bell icon to subscribe and receive updates on our latest podcasts. Ved and I will be back asking more questions in search for the elusive answers. Till then, take care.